Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 13 of Platform Enterprise, the show that platforms projects which empower. I'm your host, Rachel Donald, and alongside this podcast, I also write the Platform Enterprise newsletter, which is a weekly investigation into the policies and corruption keeping the world in crisis. Subscribe to get both the podcast and the newsletter delivered to your inbox every week at www.platformenterprise.com. All the newsletters and episodes are available on a free subscription, of course, but the best way to support Platform is to get a paid subscription of just $5 a month, for which I would be extremely grateful. Joining me today is Clare Farrell, one of the founders of the Extinction Rebellion movement. I absolutely loved this interview. Clare is a force of nature, and listening to her, it's really easy to understand how she helped create one of the fastest growing activist organizations on the planet. In today's show, we discuss climate change, capitalism, and Clare goes into great detail about XR's quote-unquote race problem. This is an awesome conversation, and I really hope you agree. If you do, please show the podcast some love and leave a 5-star rating before you go. All right, thank you so much. Enjoy the show. Thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks, love. Nice to see
you. When we spoke on the phone and introduced ourselves last week, you were talking about the fact that you're going through the process of having been arrested and being tried in court.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
How's that going? Could you, for maybe people that don't know what's going on in the UK XR branch, could you explain why it was you were arrested and why it's particularly disappointing considering the pandemic?
Yeah, sure. Well, masses of people have engaged in non-violent civil disobedience and I guess like a mass scale non-cooperation with the state, really, as part of our work. And then the cases that have just been brought recently have been put through the court system as the UK has gone into quite a serious state of lockdown. So earlier in January, a case involving myself from October 2019, so there's quite a backlog in the court, came up for trial, and I went to attend in person in court, and several other defendants came online on screen. I know there are people working to garner support basically for our charges to all be dropped, or, for cases to be dropped, in light especially of the fact that, there's a pandemic. It doesn't seem necessary that something to do with such a minor offence as sitting in a road is taking up court time at a time like now, or drawing people out into public transport or into public buildings when it's not necessary. But more importantly, I think, there's a different way to look at this, which is that as the hosts of COP later this year, what does it say to the world that a very, very successful part of the climate movement, which has significantly changed people's perception of the scale of this problem and the urgency of it, if you're putting those peaceful people on trial in a pandemic as the leaders of COP, it's not actually a very good look, is it?
What does COP? What does COP stand for?
COP is the Conference of Parties. So it's the climate negotiations that happen every year internationally. This is COP 26. So hopefully you can tell from that number that they don't work. The UK should have hosted it last year, but we postponed it because of COVID. And so it's going to be in Glasgow.
And is this political parties getting together to have a chinwag about climate change?
It's international leaders. So depending who's in power in each place, they will put forward their representatives to go and negotiate at the COP process, which obviously gave us the outcome of the Paris Agreement, which was, an amazing piece of international negotiation, in that it was the first thing that got everybody on the same page, acknowledging that there was collective effort to be made. But, it's non-binding. Donald Trump pulled out of it. I think it's questionable, really, what the impact is of Biden signing back up to it, because it's not working. Nobody's meeting their Paris commitments. We're not headed for 1.5 degrees, which is what they agreed. We're actually headed for a catastrophic level of 3 or 4 degrees by the end of this century. So
Wow.
it's not working at all. So, there are major questions for me about the way this is being dealt with. But ultimately, the UK, Boris Johnson, people are going to be looking to this country to do a good job of hosting. And the UN report that's just come out saying where the highest levels of concern are about climate change, UK is right up there. It's one of the most concerned nations on earth. And I'd like to think that we've had something to do with that, that there's such a high proportion of people that are prepared to see radical action happen because we're conscious of the fact that we're in such a dire situation.
And do you believe that concern is not reflected in the House of Parliament, considering the willingness to arrest and try
Not at
peaceful
all.
protesters?
Not
Right.
at all. And it's not just the criminal justice system, which needs to not be fucked with, right? It needs to be rigorous. it needs to be serious. It can't just bend to the whim of any old person that thinks their cause is important enough that they should go and break the law, right? That's fine. But actually, when you look at what this government is about, I mean, it's about corruption. It's about hurting poor people. It's about austerity. It's about lies. It's about corruption. It's about rot and filth. It's not about helping anyone. And it's certainly not about helping people in the global south or young people all over the world, including in this country.
Absolutely. It tends to be about helping a very small minority somewhere at the top that nothing trickles down from, shockingly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wonder how much people are going to put up with. And I think George Monbiot is doing a great job this week of saying, Boris Johnson wouldn't have a political career if the media weren't so fucking corrupt. Because it's, they've handed out contracts to people during COVID who don't know what the fuck they're doing. They've given money to their friends who have totally a different business model and said, can you help us do, procurement of life-saving equipment? And they go, oh, thanks very much. Give me, a couple of million quid and I'll just spunk it up the wall because I don't know what I'm doing. And they go, sure, here you go. I mean, that is corruption. That is corruption. And the only reason they get away with it is because there's almost no media attention that says that that's what it is, because everyone's in bed with everyone else. So it's terrifying, actually, when you look at what we're up against, because there's almost no decent information.
I want to stay on that, actually, before we go back into talking about the money strike, because immediately when I thought of, the kind of media outlet that would hold the government accountable, you can't help but think of The Guardian. But I've noticed in the research that I've been doing, the Guardian has taken somewhat of a problem with XR and has released a series of articles over the past year and a half or so about intersectionality in XR, about race in XR, about class in XR. What do you have to say about the fact that they've been so keen to come down on a climate movement?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. I mean, I don't think that people should just out and out support a flawed movement without criticism, because their cause is noble, if it appears that they've got some stuff wrong, right? So I think XR, certainly in the UK, and the kind of leadership or the foundational membership of it, we're all for a bit of criticism and trying to speak to our critics as well and understand what we can do better. I think there's something about the environmental movement, right, which everybody can agree in all over the world is in a lot of places it's very white, but I think possibly more importantly, it's overwhelmingly middle class.
Right.
So it's not a great excuse, but it's true that we are low hanging fruit, are middle class environmentalists, and those are the people with the resource and the capacity to come on board very quickly and go, yes. And when we set up, I think it felt clear to me that there were a lot of people who were just waiting for permission to do something that seemed reasonable in proportion to the situation. And those people were already engaged. And a lot of those people are middle-class people.
Mm.
Not all of them, however. And I have to say that I'm disappointed that people who put this analysis on our movement are not also talking about the fact that lots of other movements are made up of middle class people, right, who've got enough time and resource to be able to apply themselves to doing work outside of work,
Mm.
which is what this is, right? This is just work. I think we've tried really hard to make systems and processes that invite people in and offer people some small amount of support for mission critical work as well, which the way that those systems were designed at the beginning were to try and make sure that we didn't just have like a paid membership of management and then a massive volunteer base who are unpaid.
Right.
Which we tried hard not to replicate that model. And I know lots of other groups on the left that are just basically set up like that, where the free workforce of volunteers are also the people that put money in every month.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
they are also then, relatively speaking, feeling exploited by a team of hired professionals that tell them what to do, right? So we
Yeah.
tried not to do that. It wasn't perfect. It's not been perfect, but we have had a lot of these considerations to try and make sure that if you're a single parent, for example, and you want to come and give your time to the movement, that, you know, in the beginning, we were able to like support lots of different people on a needs basis. So no one got a salary, but people had access to some funds to help them with their living costs so
Right.
that
Okay.
they could ditch their career and come and work for us in theory or whatever. So that was something important that I think is little known. I think the other thing that people don't know about Exile UK, which is a shame and which we've not done a good enough job of communicating, but also, you know, when you're trying to build these relationships with integrity, it's not a PR gig. From the outset, we had a commitment to working with a group called Stop the Mangamese. We charge genocide, we charge ecocide, and they're a Pan-African reparations group who are based in London, partly. And my connections with them are with people who are also here in London. And so in a lot of ways, we've tried really hard to dedicate ourselves to something which I think is much deeper than diversity and inclusion work, which is reparations, reparatory justice, and trying to engage deeply with the needs of Black people. I think what's difficult is that we have found it really hard to mobilize a diverse section of the population. I think people are very fixated on a photograph. So they want to say there aren't enough people represented here that we can see, where, you know, you can't always see disability, you can't see class, you can't see there's lots of things you can't see. You can't see someone's gender always. There's lots of stuff about intersectional concerns which can't be represented well in a photograph. And I think quite often a lot of analysis comes from that position. And then I guess the other thing that's interesting for me is that I had a big, long conversation with one of our critics, Nafis Ahmed, and I went for coffee with him and talked in depth. And towards the end of the conversation, he said, "Oh, I've just realised actually, like, what's happened here is that you've mobilised the UK and you've brought them to London. So proportionally, the percentage of people of colour in the UK is very low compared with the percentage of people of colour in London. So when we bring people from the Shires into London to do a mass action, and if a local group has, you know, 5 or 10% people of colour in it, they look really out of place in London because it's just not diverse like London is diverse. But there's lots of things about representation are interesting to know, that the situation's like way more complex than that. And yet, I routinely hear from different parts of the movement, either somebody's gone to speak to a group in the Midlands just the other day, where obviously they're very, very diverse communities around Birmingham. And this person came to me the other day and said, actually, I've asked my local group, do they feel they experience racism in our movement and in our meetings? And they said, no, absolutely not. I've heard from other people in other groups that, yes, I absolutely do feel racism in our movement. I feel sometimes tokenized. I feel sometimes that people are not making space for me. I feel that I have to justify my presence, you know, or ask not to be used in a photo op. So there's nothing perfect about what's going on, but I think what's interesting is that there is a mixture, but there isn't a mixture of experience that's represented in the media. What's represented in the media is kind of scandalous and sensationalizing, and of course, actually, that makes it harder for us to improve the work when people are constantly plugging away at our image of being rubbish on this issue, right? So there's a lot of work to do. And I think also, we've got increasing connections growing with Black Lives Matter groups. I'm in a strategy process at the moment. And we had a Black Lives Matter representative come and do a workshop at the weekend, which was fantastic. And everyone talking about Black allyship and how to do that and how to be better at that and how to roll that sense out through the movement. But we also have, along with lots of other groups that are self-organising, I mean, we have a self-organising system, so people organise whatever teams they want. So there are lots of people working on anti-oppression work in lots of different ways. But there is also a big piece of work coming later this year, which is a co-liberation project. And I'm really excited about that because I think it seeks to use a slightly different lens to what the usual approach to anti-oppression is, which can feel kind of patriarchal and transactional. And actually, the liberation frame encourages us to see that instead of saying someone takes up too much space, that we don't need to take them down, but maybe we need to just make more space,
Right.
if you see what I mean. So it's not so much of a sort of push and pull as a sort of a collective uplift. And I'm really excited to see what comes with that, but it will require like a lot of co-learning and unlearning and education throughout the movement and stuff. And then for me as a media team person, it's like, how do we represent this without tokenizing it and doing what I think some people in the movement want to do, which is like take an action and then go, see, we're doing it. Because they actually want to feel better because they feel bad about the things that are not right and about the representation that we get in the media on these issues. So it's complex, and like we're deeply embedded in trying to improve things all the time. Yeah.
What do you think is or did you perceive a difference in when the kind of barrage of criticism came towards XR? Did you see a difference between the people who just wanted to critique and sensationalize, and people that wanted to critique in order to enable XR's evolution?
Yeah, well, I guess it's hard to say. I mean, I think that some of the criticism comes from a good place, but I think it also sometimes comes from a place of like, we know best and you're getting it wrong, so we're going to tell you that you're bad and that you're wrong. And I find that kind of attitude of some of it quite unhelpful. Like I've tried not to go out into the world as a person in XR and say, oh, I've worked it all out, here's the answers, this is what we should be doing, this is what you should think, and I've got the solution. So there's something about the way that we work and the way that we set up, which was I think designed to celebrate and support curiosity and accept that we don't know everything and that we don't have all the answers, right? And we didn't want to come out and say, look at all this big complex mess, we've got a simple answer, here you go. I understand that's a bit of a paradox because we do have a simple answer, and that is participative democracy. and our three demands are quite simplistic. And I think that's part of something that works really well for us in terms of communications. But I would say, in the spirit of not saying that we want power ourselves and not saying that we've got all the answers ourselves, I mean, I thought that it would carry through really obviously to people, and it obviously hasn't, that by having representative, participative political process would see immediately a balanced representation for people who are marginalized in our society today. So if we had a citizens' assembly with teeth, as you might say, with a legally binding capacity, you would have like gender balance that matches the country.
Mm.
You would have balance of people on a socio-economic basis, whether that's to do with race, religion, class, gender, sexuality, anything that you can embed in these set of rules, you would have all those people represented. So
Mm.
from the outset of like having our third demand met, you would have the highest opportunity, I would say, for political inclusion and justice. And I presumed that having that as our goal, to give that power to other people that we don't know,
Mhm.
would be seen as something that was like ultimately seeking a highly justice orientated outcome.
Mhm.
And yet, I don't think that's landed with a lot of people. And then they say, "Oh, you don't care about justice." um, and that's really difficult, because I also think that, I don't know if you saw a recent article from Gordon Brown. This is really interesting, saying that he thinks that the UK is on the brink of becoming a failed state. Well, not on the brink, but like well on the way. And that includes, particularly because of Brexit, the devolution of power needs to go to more localized citizens' assemblies in order to enhance democracy, so that people feel they've got access to power in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in Wales, and across England, because people obviously feel that they're so powerless and they've got no agency, right? And the government is fucking everything up royally. So with that in mind, I think if people can imagine the participation increasing in politics, then you will have ordinary people who are experts in what they personally need having access to saying, this is what we need. And I think that's probably kind of what justice is really about. It's about everybody being heard and having their needs met. And yeah, I think there's lots of work to do to sort of explore what this like shift in the political reality that we're living with could do, aside from what we sort of usually champion, which is, ordinary citizens aren't corrupt, they don't have vested interests, they don't have party affiliations, they don't have to win an election, they're not trying to be popular. There's all kinds of reasons why like ordinary people can probably make better decisions about these things than our current politicians.
Yeah.
But even just the representation piece has been totally not, feels like it's just not gone in,
Mm.
feels like people have just not recognized that that's actually massive, and would be a huge step towards social justice for people. But yeah.
It seemed to me the problem that people perceived with XR was its sort of middle class origin, and perhaps therefore that any participative democracy would remain a proponent of class. But I found it very interesting to read through, because I mean, one of the criticisms I saw in, I think, a Guardian article was the fact that it was started in a middle class kitchen in a rural town. And I was just kind of gobsmacked that a movement could be criticized for its origin, for where it started.
Yeah.
Would it be better for it to have not started? Because I mean, XR has spoken to so many people, and I do wonder if the what you're talking about here, like this kind of evolution of democratic process, but remaining democratic. So devolving power, but not complete anarchy. I think this is why XR has been such a popular movement all over the world, because it speaks to a vast majority of people for whom anarchy or other systems, political systems that involve a complete overhaul of what we currently have, it's quite frightening, and
Yeah.
it's not what they want. And you're proposing to kind of fill this gap between a failing centralized government and disenfranchised and disempowered people.
Yeah, and I also think that, more democracy is probably the only option that we've got other than less democracy. Position
Hmm.
that we're in, the conditions that we're facing, and we also launched on this, was, you know, resource scarcity, increasing hostility between nation states, increasing propensity for people to vote for a strongman leader, increasing sort of nostalgia about
Mm.
make America great again, or whatever it is. The conditions are ripe for fascism. And a lot of signs have been showing for many years that there are ripe conditions for fascism in many places. And people love to say never again about the war. and about fascism, and yet they don't seem interested in preemptively trying to create more inclusive and generous politics, which
Mm.
can stop people hopefully from veering over into something which is very much led by fear into the far right. You know, we've lived through the whipping up of xenophobia and racism in the UK, which bolstered the Brexit campaign and stoked vast division in this country. And ultimately, you know, and this is a frame, and this is a bit of communication and work that we've not got right yet, in my opinion. But you know, everyone's kind of collectively losing against a very, very tiny number of people who are winning off the situation as it is now. And it seems really important to be able to unite people across divides, which is also kind of why we went out and said we advocate for a non-partisan political solution, because it doesn't really matter whether you like each other or not. If you want to survive, you've got to work together right now. That's the kind of
Mm.
situation that we found ourselves in. And it is necessary to try and bring everyone with you, right? And not go around pointing the finger and blaming and shaming and saying, well, I don't like your politics, so I'm not going to talk to you. No, no,
Mhm.
no. We've got
Mhm.
to be way more grown up than that, and way
Mhm.
more able to listen than that, and way more able to understand that like people's values are often not as far apart as they seem, right? And I think that's the other key thing about the assembly, which I don't think people understand well, which is that it's the thinking behind an assembly is that you have deliberation. So at the moment, our politics is combative. It's like people having a debating society over some old boxes, right, in an old Hogwarts type room. Yeah, and it strikes me that, like, when you learn to do debating, if you're I mean, I didn't really understand all of this until a little while ago when I got invited to go to a debating society. I got there and I was like, I don't know how to be in this space, right? I don't fucking belong here. But I went in there and it's like, oh, you can just advocate for something that you don't believe in, right? And the point is just to win.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what you think. And if you win, you leave thinking, yeah, I won, even if what you were on the side of was actually abhorrent, right? So it strikes me that the way that like debate goes on in our like, you know, political chambers is like that. So it's not serious. It's not actually serious about fixing problems for the best, for the greater good. It's actually about like winning and losing.
Mhm.
And deliberation is not about winning or losing, because it's about trying to find the best way through a complex situation. And when you find a group of strangers put together to do that work, the evidence suggests that that empathic work that they have to do interpersonally with each other, getting over their divides, letting go of some of their judgments of each other, at the end of a long process of working in an assembly together, you have people that realize, oh my God, I used to be. It's this amazing story in Ireland. This really homophobic older guy who goes into the process to talk about gay marriage and looks at like a young queer guy who sits on his table and thinks, you know, oh God, he's gay or whatever that goes through his mind. And at the end of the process, comes out in an interview and says, this kid is like a son to me. I've been homophobic my entire life and I've realized why. And it's because I was abused. It's because I was raised that way. I fucking hated gay people all my life. And it's disgusting. And I've changed because of this process. So it's like
Mhm.
personally transformative. And because it's like an empathic process, it tends to create progressive and very humanistic kind of outcomes and policy suggestions. And so I think that's like not really understood
Mm.
by people, is that the intention is to create a political space where a different thing happens. We're not
Mm.
talking about people going and having an argument about like, what's right and wrong or what's the best thing for the economy. I'm talking about people going into a space and overcoming separation and
Mhm.
feeling collective empowerment and feeling collective responsibility and rising into that place of responsibility because they're not used to it, right? People are not used to being able to make decisions about the way the world works, actually. We do live in a powerless context. And so I do think that they can be transformative things. And I'm certain that they're not perfect and they're not the end of the process and they're not like the only thing that we can do. But I certainly think that they're, for many, many reasons, they're like the best thing I've heard as a suggestion for like how to deal with this in a way which gives you like a kind response and a thoughtful response. And we can't leave this in the hands of our leaders.
Yeah.
I mean, anywhere. You can't.
Yeah.
Like,
I
you
think
can't.
I think the psychology of the human brain simply cannot fathom the responsibility of leading a nation. I think that's why it does so often like seem like games all around the world for these people, because it's a surreal environment. It's an unreal thing to lead a nation state, which is simply a territory that's had its borders cut out and millions of people depending on you. That would make my brain explode. You know, of course they relegate it to some kind of infantile process. Otherwise, their brains would explode, I think. One thing I want to ask on that with the democratic assemblies is, because you've been involved in activism for years and years and years, and deep in XR. And so have you had the chance to see the climate movement be the springboard that propels people from two different political sides or from completely different ways of life into empathic relationship, as you say? Have you seen the climate movement as something that's been able to help people overcome their differences for a bigger goal?
Yes, definitely. And I was talking to someone about this earlier. I don't think, although we tried to create a framing which presents you with a universal existential threat with the hope that we would kind of not alienate one side or the other in terms of the left right political divide. I think, you know, we've definitely got some liberal Democrats. We've definitely got Labour Party membership and we've definitely got Green Party membership. I don't know that we've actually properly mobilised that many Tories, to be honest. We've got some ex-Tories, but they're not Tories anymore. and they're quite interesting people to talk to, you know, that could say, I used to be a Conservative Party member and now I'm doing this. But a lot of them have a transition phase through like Green Party politics or something. Yeah. No, I think the thing that I'm interested in a way is like, I don't know if you've ever seen like the spectrum of support as a way of looking at like support and allyship for movements. But it's important that we build a big base because we want to do a mass movement, but it's also really important that we've got like the soft support of quite a lot of people who basically, you know, will just advocate for what we do as like being good work. And they might not necessarily ever join us on the streets until the final hour when they finally go, oh shit, I better go and join them. Like there are those people, they won't come until the very end, but they might be more conservatively minded and they might be sitting at work, you know, with someone saying, can't believe they did X, Y, Z. And they'll go, actually, I can believe it. I think it's, you know, legitimate. We need to change the paradigm that we're working in. And actually, you know, it's hard because everything about our culture now is like to do with separation, exploitation, oppression, you know, damage, harm, profit, othering, in groups and out groups, winning and losing. But we've just got to work together, folks. We've just got to sort that out. In a way, I feel like this also relates to one of the problems that we have with the way that the Green movement gets pitted against Labour movement. So by Labour, I don't mean the Labour Party in the UK. I mean like workers, unions and stuff. Because my background's in fashion and our fashion campaign ran a boycott, which was like stop buying new stuff for a year. I'm pretty certain that our little band of activists didn't have a very big impact on the fashion industry by not shopping for a year, right? I think it's unfortunate, perhaps, that some people that shop ethically shopped less.
Mm,
Perhaps
yeah.
that was a knock-on effect, which was bad, but I doubt it included vast numbers of people. But it brought the argument very quickly from people that work with garment trade unions, garment workers unions and stuff. You know, if you call for a boycott, that's bad for workers. So you can't be anti-consumption and pro-worker. That's what that surfaced, was the fact that we can't apparently hold that paradox, or that we put that in binary, and then we put the green movement versus people that are working for workers.
Mm.
And that's a problem that has
Hmm.
to be overcome, because we can't allow ourselves to be put in competition with people that are fighting for a better life and better rights for people in, our supply chains or whatever.
No, you're totally right. You're totally right. I had somebody on the show who said something brilliant. He was like, cancel culture only hurts the left. You never see anybody on the right getting cancelled. And you do not see the same infighting in right wing groups and right wing
Yeah.
parties. And in fact, how many right wing parties are there? Just one, you know. Every country's got their one, and then they've got their super right wing one, like the
Yeah.
Brexit party, or the teacup party, or whatever it was in the US. And that's just like a bunch of fascists getting together and having some fun
Mm.
at the expense of many, many people. But there's just not that same infighting. And that is how they stay in power, because it's extremely easy on the left for us to infight and then see change because other people on the left want to listen. Like, we do want to do better, and we want a more social world, and we want climate movement and all of this stuff. So if you want a quick fix, you're going to go and critique somebody else that's on the same political bias as you, and you know what? They'll change. All the while, right-wing near fascists are in power everywhere, because it's extremely hard work going and
Yeah.
getting them to change. And there's no united front.
Yeah. Yeah, and
And we need
we've been divided and ruled. I mean, if people are interested in this, I'd really recommend they look up Ian Haney Lopez, an academic in America who wrote a book called Merge Left. And I suspect that some of that work was really influential on people's campaigning in the US to get the Democrats back in. I don't know if it was as successful or rolled out as much as it could have been, because my understanding is that actually Biden won sort of not that strongly, in an astonishing way, given the murderous death count that is Donald Trump's fault. The idea being that, like, if you don't merge race and class as, like, get people to understand that they're natural bedfellows, you don't have to see yourselves as separated. I think he talks about, like, the class left and the race left, basically,
Mhm.
and how those people need to overcome divides in order to create a really powerful united front, which is
Mhm.
going to strive for a more just society. And yeah, his work's really compelling. And I think just the other day there was an article by the founder of Black Lives Matter. The headline that's attached to it says, we need to work with people that aren't like us. So there's lots of people actually trying to, like, front this kind of message of unity and coming together and finding power together. But it's not something that serves the media's agenda or the government's agenda. So it doesn't get nearly as much airtime as it should, because there are actually more people than you think who are calling for people to come together, rather than infinitely divide each other into smaller and smaller categories.
No matter what movement you're fighting for, a politics that is not interested in dialogue is not a change. Is not a change from what we have, even if there's a good intention behind it. Ultimately, those things tend to fall very quickly into another form of authoritarianism, and we have seen that with excellent left movements in history.
Well, and also the other thing about movements that I think is important to mention here is non-violence. There's this wonderful woman in our movement, Rowan, who I've been just in dialogue with recently, and I know that she has a very, like, deep and long time commitment and experience in using non-violence. And we set XR up with an explicit statement, we would behave in line with nonviolent theory. And she's just written this paper that I read last night, and it says, a lot of the climate movement seems to be not violent, but they don't go out and say we are non-violent.
Okay.
They don't think about how non-violence is proactive and how you go out with a commitment that you will do non-cooperation, and if someone hits you, you won't try and kill them back, you know.
Okay. Hmm.
And it'd be really interesting for you to talk to people about this, but I think it's clear to me that when you're faced with this possibility of doing something to cause significant and rapid social change, which is what movements set out to do, you have to do it with the intention that you're not going to create a shitty outcome by accident.
Yeah.
Because so often, if you create the conditions for rapid change and something goes, if the other thing's not built yet, then people come in and do something that they've already got lined up, which is usually not very good. Or if you create a power vacuum, the right can swing in and take up all the space and dominate it. There's so many ways that, movements and struggles can create the conditions for social change, and then accidentally, whoop, oh, it's gone in a really nasty direction, and you
Mhm.
end up with a successful mobilization that created something good for 6 weeks, which fell apart, and then you have authoritarianism or
Yeah.
whatever. And
Yeah.
I think it's really important that one of the things that we had looked at in the research was that nonviolence seems to be one of the most significant factors that you can adhere to in order to aim for like a humane and civil outcome. Because when you
Yeah.
have a movement that resorts to violence, even if it's in part it resorts to violence, but it also has non-violence, it statistically is more likely to have an outcome which has a degraded political reality rather than an improved
Mm.
and compassionate one. And so I think that's also a really interesting thing to think about and to investigate. And I think there's certainly a lack of understanding of like what the difference is between not doing violence and being committed to non-violence and saying it out there, saying I am non-violent, that's what I'm doing.
I want to ask you then, there is a trend, and I say trend because I actually see it the most on social media. I don't see it particularly in active circles, but there's definitely a trend amongst young woke or activist or whatever, young disenfranchised people who are understandably so, to call for eat the rich. And there is a lot of violence in on social media and on those spaces about the anger directed towards the wealthy, towards capitalism, etc.
Mm,
um and it's funny when you read a tweet. When you see it happen a lot, it starts to be a little bit concerning, and I was wondering
yeah.
if you'd be interested in commenting on that, considering what you've just said about non-violence as a foundation for a movement.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's another thing that I think some of the people that have criticized us, as we were talking about earlier, have misinterpreted somewhat, that we're not serious about addressing inequality because we don't seek to call out the rich and say that they should be destroyed or they should be eaten or that we should somehow have like a class war.
Mm,
Um, I mean, we might be wrong, right?
mm,
The thing we're advocating for might be the wrong approach. We might be barking up the wrong tree. But I think if we've got to make this transition very, very quickly, and some people are going to lose out who are
mm,
very wealthy, very privileged, whatever. Like the 1% have to like reduce their lifestyles consumption. They have to. The middle class probably also have to. That's a lot of people who are currently in positions of power everywhere, all over our society. And so we have tried to set ourselves up where we're capable of being in dialogue with those people rather than being in combat with them. That said, I don't think it stops us from being able to criticize the nature of the system that keeps them living the way they live, and keeps other people living the way they live and increasing this sort of spiraling gap between the rich and the poor, because it's obvious that that's just getting worse and worse and worse. But I don't think, personally, that, well, sometimes I really, really want to criticize some people, but I don't think that blaming and shaming people and declaring certain people to be beyond redemption just because they're winning at a system which is like rigged and disgusting and neo-colonial, I don't think it's that helpful to make it personal when the problem is systemic.
Right.
And I also think that enraged people that take their sort of totally justified fury and translate that into nonviolent action, I don't think that those people need guiding to a place where they've sort of got it in for individuals, or where they've got it in for certain individuals to say, basically, you're the problem, you need to be taken down a peg or two, and then that will somehow solve our problems. Because it
Right.
just because you take a few of those people out of their position of privilege, or you take away some of their material stuff or money or whatever, doesn't change the fact that the system's totally set up to just reproduce them again.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I think that like most of the systems of power that we have at the moment, in my awareness, are systems that reward psychopaths and narcissists, and then proceed to celebrate them and tell everybody in the world, look at this wonderful person, you should be more like this.
Yeah.
I've got
Yeah.
a friend who says, it's sad, isn't it, that a lot of people would rather that their child grew up to be rich than kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's what we're swimming in. And I think calling individuals out for that is not the optimum solution, although it might be quite satisfying sometimes. And
Mm.
occasionally I can't hold back and I say very rude things about people like Philip Green or Jeff Bezos, or I mean,
Uh,
there are there are people that I have personal feelings about, but I don't think that that's the basis of a campaign.
I agree with you, and I think that too often when discussing these kind of anomalous creatures, the anomaly is the person who wins this game. We take this kind of moral high ground as if we would be any different, having been given the same opportunity, or
Yeah.
the same structure, the same environment. God, I'm not narcissistic enough to believe that I would be the one billionaire that was completely different to all the rest. Like, why are they so similar? Yes, there's definitely underlying things, and which research has proven, like psychopathy and narcissism. But also, are people born like that, or is that kind of engendered in
There,
that journey as
there was
well?
there was some really interesting research a while ago. I can't remember which university ran it, but it was basically like people were sharing it online, saying like, "Here you go. Here's the social science. It's proof that if you're rich, you become a dick." Right? Basically, that's what it said, and it was really. I found it really amusing because uh, I'm sure that part of what it said was like, in order to be able to deal with the scale of the inequality that you are on the top end of as
Mhm.
someone who's like, let's say, a multimillionaire, you have to do something in your own mind to reassure yourself that that's okay, because you know that it's not. So you convince yourself that you're a bit exceptional, and then you convince yourself that you're slightly more exceptional, and then you go down that road of like justifying why it's okay that you're super rich when you know
Mhm.
like tons of people have nothing.
Yeah.
And the way that our society is sort of stratified also means that you can exist in that world and not see poor people, not
Yes.
see people on the streets, and not see people who are suffering. And if you choose not to watch the certain news reports or TV, or where it does get reported on, which is not enough, then you don't have to understand that there are like millions of children living in poverty in the UK who don't have enough to eat, even though we're one of the richest countries in the world. Like,
Yeah.
you can just ignore all of that stuff.
Mhm.
And whilst at the same time, you know, go over things in your own kind of consciousness for like
Mhm.
why you actually did make that deal at the right time and no one
Yeah.
else would have done that.
Yeah.
Why you did make the right call at that time when you were that age and when you made that decision and when you won on that whatever it is. It's like it's makes sense. I mean, I'm not an expert on this stuff, so but I really remember when that research came out and there was delight all over, like lots of lots of people that I knew were like, see, here's the
Mhm.
proof, someone's proved it.
But
Getting
that's
rich is
but
bad for you.
But exactly, and that's why you're so right what you're saying about, like, it shouldn't actually be personal, it needs to be systemic change, because the thing, these people are suffering. Do you know what? If you're a dick, right, no matter how many jets you own, you're suffering on some kind of like moral or spiritual level.
Well, I
And
think there is evidence that in highly unequal societies like the UK and America and Europe, there are higher levels of mental health problems and there are higher levels of addiction. There are higher levels of severe social problems
yeah,
that people experience, which don't relate, which do seem to relate quite clearly to
yeah.
the scale of the inequality, right? And
I mean,
so it's almost like the focus doesn't need to be on how rich people are. The focus needs to be on the gap, the
absolutely.
inequality gap. Like none of this is my like specialist area, but it's interesting.
Policy needs to be like, and we will go back to your specialist area, the climate movement. But like, I definitely think that policy needs to relate the two things, like riches and poverty. When people say like, oh, cap billionaires' wealth, how about saying like, okay, you can't earn more than X% of your lowest paid worker? Put that relation into law, put it into policy, because there is a relation. And going after individuals for their mental deficiencies or emotional deficiencies, it's just not a solution that where we all win. And we're running out of time asking nicely.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I think also if you go to like a systems based conversation or analysis and then have a real big look at like what's possible. I think, there's some people in the UK who've launched Money Rebellion, which is trying to advocate for tax strikes, debt strikes, taking out credit card loans and not paying them back. The possibility for exploration in terms of like what's going on economically is actually vast. And if you look at, well, you'll know about Kate Raworth's work on donut economics.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
actually being rolled out in Amsterdam. That's
Yeah.
actually being rolled out in other cities. We're starting to see some experimental, well, things that people could have seen as very experimental in terms of economics being tested on the ground to see what happens, right? And to try and work out what else is out there. And
Mm-hmm.
we're not looking at the Money Rebellion folks. It's not that there's a shortage of ideas. There's a lot of ideas, and there's a lot of different ways that we could, deal with exchange and trust and value and all of those, critical things, which are like part of what the economy is about, right?
Hmm.
So again, I would just say that I wouldn't like to say that I've got answers to how to deal with these problems, but we certainly know some of them are really obvious, like vast inequality, and just encourage people to become like super curious about what possibilities there are for doing things differently, because there's just so much, and there's nothing in the sort of mass communications media world right now that I can see that is like serious about helping people to like situate themselves in a world which is rapidly changing, which is embedded in a deep, deep crisis, and where there's actually like abundance of like different creative, beautiful, thoughtful ways to respond. But it's hard to see how we can share these messages kind of any bigger than we already are, because
Yeah.
there's so few channels and they move so slowly in terms of
Mhm.
opening themselves up to these conversations. But I would really totally, if people are interested in this stuff, check out Money Rebellion and some of the people that they've been in dialogue with, and they'll continue to bring more and more people forward to present their ideas, because there's loads.
Fantastic. What else is Extinction Rebellion hoping to achieve in 2021?
Well, engaged in the moment in a strategy development process, which is quite complicated and big, and attempting to pull together the participation of quite a large group of people, which is a bit of a like cross section of the movement. So that's kind of an experiment in itself. We've never done it that way before. I don't know how it's going to go. It's definitely difficult always to write strategy on behalf of a mass movement that we've intentionally encouraged to work together who don't agree on lots
Yeah.
of stuff. So that's interesting. And I know that people are really keen to get back out on the streets. I know that people are really behind the financial disobedience work for Money Rebellion. I know that loads of people want to do serious work on anti racism and alignment with lots of those issues, which we spoke about earlier, that haven't been visible enough and haven't been messaged enough by us. And so, yeah, I really don't know what the future is going to hold, because at the moment we're like in a really nasty lockdown with a devastatingly shit government response to COVID that we've like, and we're just going into Brexit time, which I think everyone's somehow not managed to prepare themselves for
Yeah.
mentally, emotionally, or practically. So
Yeah.
I'm anticipating that we have, lots and lots of issues with supply, lots of issues with export, lots of issues, people that I know that run businesses that can't. Literally, the advice from the government last week was, if you've got a problem with exporting from the UK to Europe as a British business, you should set up your business in Europe.
You're joking.
That's the official line, folks. So, we're in this, we're really in the throes of quite a lot in the UK, in addition to COVID, which is massive. And I anticipate that there will be like severe economic repercussions for what's just happened. And all of this stuff makes it quite hard to plan, I guess, what you're going to do as a social movement. But I definitely think that there is a decent appetite for more civil disobedience. I definitely think that we'll be back out on the streets later this year, but I just can't tell you the date. Like in previous years, I would have said, before COVID hit us, I would have said, right, we've got this plan. We're going out here, here, and here.
Yeah.
We're going to do this, this, and this.
Yeah.
And I just can't answer those questions like that anymore, because we don't know right now when people are going to go back out and when people are going to feel safe to go back out.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I was like, we did an experiment once with this guy who came to do some workshops with us, and he asked us to like sit down and write down in our notebook, like, if you were the benevolent dictator of Exile, what would you do? What would you actually do if you could like boss around the whole movement and say what it should do and what it shouldn't do?
Oh,
And I find that quite a fun exercise to like think, right, what do I think? And it can
yeah.
really help you get clear. You think, right, what do I think? And then how would my ideas like shape the work of different teams that I don't work with, or shape the work of my team in a way that I don't normally think of, because I don't dream big scale enough or whatever. Anyway, I found useful exercise. And I sort of did a bit of that the other day on my own. And I thought, Claire, what is the most important thing? And I'm not on my own in thinking this, because I think a lot of people in the strategy team think the same. I feel strongly that this year there's like a need for like a big push on mobilization, because what we've done before is, peak at a certain point, and then movements do this. They sort of contract, the energy goes down, and then you have another spurt and you go again and you do something big again. And so we're in a bit of a cycle of like, rise and fall in terms of our presence on the streets and doing these big actions. And I feel like there's a load of work that goes on in Exile, which is about like community building and people working together on different topics. There's people working on like local democracy work called Trust the People, that they're trying to bring together like localized assemblies that are not about climate, they're just about local issues, just to like encourage people to meet and try and affect change in their area and be interested in participation in local politics. And then there's the fashion team who are trying to do something like looking towards bringing together people from across the fashion system to look together collectively at like how to fix that system. there's just loads of parts to the work where people are like continuing to work in their area that they're focused on and building their communities. And I think thinking about a way to mobilize through some of those spaces so that it continues to sort of encourage people to be prepared to take action together. Because
Right.
I think we get stuck sometimes with a false binary, like, should it be about community and building a movement, or should it be about big mobilizations that go out and make a massive noise and get thousands of people in jail cells or whatever? And I think it's our kind of propensity to resort to binary thinking leaves us often thinking it's like one versus the other.
Mm.
And I think it's crucial this year that we bring those two together
Yeah.
better than we ever have done before,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Like a bilateral movement in
Yeah,
which, those two ideologies or sources that are feeding each other and complementing each other and
yeah,
enabling more and more to happen. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
That's fantastic.
No pressure.
Oh my God. I'm so impressed what you guys have managed to achieve in 2 years, like the success of it, having like 70 chapters around the world, having turned so many people onto the climate movement and made, despite having a pretty intense name, Extinction Rebellion, like despite that, like speaking to so
Yeah.
many people. It's amazing.
Well, it's called in so many people who were like just ready to do something,
Yeah.
and some of the foundations were laid really well by us. Some of them were not really very good. Some of them have gone wrong. Some things are not perfect. But I think it's a lot of it has to do with like timing, the fact that people have known about this for so fucking long. Like, we did something right at the right time, but we also, people who were paying attention were like, deep down, they were thinking, God, oh God, we're fucked. And literally no one's doing anything. Like, you can have an article in The Guardian that says, oh, several billion people could die because of this crisis by X date. And it literally doesn't cause any
Yeah.
news. Like no one goes, hang on a minute, what's that mean? Like just literally has no impact, that stuff. So I mean, there's enough people who've been watching this stuff unfold for like decades who just thought, fuck yeah, let's go. This is totally appropriate. And in a way, I think when we launched, we wanted to shift the Overton window. We wanted to shift the public discourse. That was one of
Yeah.
the things we wanted to move. And we wanted people to understand that it was like totally an existential crisis and it was fucking now
Yeah.
and needs to act now. And in a way, that part of the work got underway fast. Like, I mean,
Mm.
just so quick. Just things felt like they moved so quick. Public perception and being able to get people to look at the language they're using and whether or not it's appropriate and how can we talk about this better and how can we talk about it more. And all of that seems to have sort of, in a lot of ways, I'd say that's like everyone's got the message, right? Like most people know that we're in a planetary crisis. I feel a little bit inclined to say that like we've got to now think about what's the next Overton window shift that we need to do, because it's not about the climate emergency and the ecological emergency necessarily. And I was thinking this morning about it, and I think actually maybe it's just to shift people's perception of the fact that change is possible. I don't think people feel like political and social change is really a thing that really happens. When we always referenced at the beginning, like women's suffrage or Martin Luther King's civil rights movement or Gandhi or whatever, and all this stuff feels a bit, I mean, a lot of it's not that long ago. None of those things I've mentioned are very long ago,
Yeah.
actually, but they feel like they're from a different era
Yeah.
and it doesn't feel realistic
Yeah.
people, I think, now to think that there's possibility for things to change. And that whole Thatcher kind of neoliberal, there's no other option, there is no other way. We're so deeply in that. We wrote a book called Exile's Guide to the Impossible at the beginning of the pandemic. Me and my friends worked on that, and it was to try and like issue a bit of a like encouragement and support to the movement, I guess, in saying
Yeah.
like what we're trying to do here is basically impossible, folks. But unless you're trying to do something impossible, you're not asking for the right outcome, I think,
Yeah.
because things are so fucked. And so So it's kind of, yeah, leaning into that framing of the impossible and the fact that like the impossible has happened before and
Mm.
can happen again. There's something brewing anyway on that.
What a fantastic note to end on, actually. The fact that all social change is impossible in the sphere in which it starts. And yet, look what it can engender in the matter of years, decades. So here's to the impossible.
Definitely.
Claire, who would you like to platform?
Well, I was having a think about this, and I hope you won't mind me saying it because I know that he doesn't have very much time. But I think it would be cool if you spoke to my friend Charlie Waterhouse.
Okay. Charlie Waterhouse.
He's somebody that I've worked with for quite some time, and he's worked on the Brixton Pound, and he worked with me on the identity for Extinction Rebellion stuff. Yeah, I think you'll find him very interesting, and he's a super eloquent person, and I don't hear him speaking enough.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll get in touch with him. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This was brilliant. I loved it.
Thanks for having me, love.
Pleasure. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed that. You can find Extinction Rebellion on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and there are over 80 national branches around the world if you want to get involved. Also, head over to www.platformenterprise.com and subscribe so that one day we won't all be dependent on Silicon Valley oligarchs. All right, everyone. Thank you for supporting the podcast. See you next week.